Um, so Will, let's get it started.
We're live.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. All right, all. I'm very glad to have you. So I wanted to talk about playing poetry this week. We talked about playing the argument last week, and I started going into poetry a bit in that, both how it serves the argument, but also how it can get in the way, not in the writing, but in how we approach it and how we play it. So I thought it might be a nice sort of sister lecture to talk about the poetry and both about playing it and about the function it serves, or I feel like it serves in the text. So as far as the artistic or aesthetic function, I don't really think I need to go on about it. It's beautiful, and we can take joy both in the rhythm of it and its images, etc. And it is there for that. But as I keep trying to come back to, and I hope it will remain, this is really, I want this to be a class about craft. I don't want to, how we function with poetry, how we look at poetry can be a very personal thing. I want to help you understand both what I think it serves actively in the text and how you can actively play it and approach it in a way that is both satisfying for you and can help the audience's ear, both to take it in and not lose the argument within it, which is part of what I was talking about last week. So what is the practical purpose of poetry? And we did talk a little bit about this last week. It is to expand the world. It is to expand the world of what we're talking about, expand the world of the argument, and to draw us back to a greater lens within which we view the world and we view the argument. And that greater lens can be both widening. We can be talking about the heavens, the gods, the hells, the myths, or it can be zooming in, you know, the beauty of the blooming of a flower. So we can get very small or we can get very large, but poetry, in either sense, poetry expands the world of the play and the lens of the argument. And so in a basic practical sense, if you expand your argument to the universal, if you expand it to the world, it's a better argument, so long as it works. But it should be a better argument if you can expand it beyond the realms of the practical. So how does it do this? You're relating the argument, what your character's fighting for, what they need. You're relating it to the universal. You're relating it to the sort of seemingly fundamental truths about the natural and mythic world. And these, by doing so, you are encompassing both more arguments, more people, more belief systems. Poetry widens the network of the argument. It widens the encapsulation of the language. And in so doing, it expands our willingness to embrace it. When I say our, I mean both the audience and by the intent of the character, hopefully the other characters on stage. You know, another thing that poetry does is that it makes the inexpressible expressible, right? So there is so much in which we feel like words fail us. We can't get to that feeling. We can't fully describe what something is like. We feel something so deeply that words fail it. Nietzsche has a famous quote, you know, that for which we find words is something already dead in our hearts. Now, I don't necessarily always agree with that, but I think the sentiment of it is reflected in that feeling we sometimes have that we cannot fully express what we're feeling. And I think that poetry is our sort of battle line against that. It's our attempt to shape feeling out of words in a sort of non-practical way. So I wanted to take a brief look at a little piece from the Scottish play. I'm not going to throw a link up. I don't think we all need to view it. It's very small, but I think it's a good example. It's in Macbeth's If It Were Done When 'Tis Done, and he's speaking about why he shouldn't kill Duncan, right? He doesn't want to, or he's fighting against the urge to. He's fighting against his wife's urging, he's fighting against perhaps his own ambition, but he starts with a list, and the list starts very practically and then gets very poetic. And I want to look at it real quick. So it starts with him saying, he's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then as his host, who should against the murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. So we start very practically. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed, right? So as his subject, as his loyal subject, as someone related to him, I shouldn't murder him. Also as his host and the laws of hosting, I owe him safety and protection. And then Macbeth gets to this idea of nobody will celebrate my becoming king. Everyone will mourn for Duncan. Everyone will shed, he's been such a good king. And there's some bitterness in that. I think you can find some bitterness in the Scotsman's language as he says it. But for whatever reason, Macbeth needs to expand to the mythic in describing it, personifying pity, riding upon the air, the wind spreading tears to all the onlookers. What this does is it expands the world of Duncan's death. It expands, and maybe, I don't know if it's about making the inexpressible expressible in this case, but if maybe the Scotsman struggles to encounter with the fact that it is the mourning for Duncan, not the celebration for him, that is an assault on his ego. Now that's getting a little heady. I don't know. I think you can make that argument or not if you're playing the part. But it is an expansion into the poetic that makes it not just the practical, I shouldn't murder him for these very simple reasons, but in a sort of wider world, mythic way, I can't murder him. If I do, all nature will mourn. And of course, Macbeth does, and all nature does mourn. As the old man later describes horses dying and going mad, it's similar to the night of Caesar's execution. This is the mythic world reacting to human events, the expansion of our personal to the wider world, to the universal. Another Nietzsche quote, and one of my favorites, is him saying, "Every culture that has lost myth has lost, by the same token, its natural, healthy creativity. Only a horizon ringed about with myth can unify a culture." So it is the unifying horizon. I love that image of myth that brings us together, that unifies us as a culture. You know, it is our shared experience. It is our shared reference point. You know, religion plays that role in some ways, but, you know, I think it goes beyond that. And poetry is our invocation of that. So anyway, I don't want to get too heady. I want to try to stick to the practical, but that is the function I think it serves. It expands the world in that way. And in so doing, it both expands an argument, making it more universal and more capable of persuading others and to appealing to the gods and the hells. And separately, often we're using poetry to express the inexpressible. Either something that a character has tried to express and just can't get to, or sometimes something that a character can't lay his or her hands on at all, and it is the only means by which he can express it. So, you know, myth in this sense, you know, they're the imaginative forces by which we contextualize the world. So that's a bit heady, but I think that is poetry's function in this work, and I think it's what we're looking to evoke and invoke when we're getting into it. So to the more practical, how do we play it? I've tried to really. I think poetry is where a lot of us get lost. So I really tried to make this as practical as possible. So some of it might even seem rudimentary. So forgive me for that if it does, but reminders are always helpful. So first, specificity is key. Okay, so number one, specificity is key. That means that doesn't just mean looking it up in your lexicon or your Arden or sort of knowing what it is. If I ask, you know, what does this mean? And you have to sort of reference your side sheet to tell me, it's not there yet. You haven't done the work. Now, I'm glad you looked it up. And this is this class is process. So I don't want anybody to feel guilt about having to check their side sheet, but I'm just saying you haven't gotten there yet. Step one with poetry is specificity, and writing something down isn't specificity. You need to truly understand both its meaning and its purpose. What is it doing there? Why is it in the text? Why is the character invoking this poetry, saying this poetry, using it? So what does it really mean? Not, I have to check it, but like, what have I ingrained? What does it really mean to me? What do I know it means and know that it means? And what function is it serving for me? What point does it make? Why is it there? What is the argument? So this relates to our lecture last week. So what is the argument? And how does the poetry relate to that? And in a more basic sense, why has Shakespeare written it? If our great task, and I think it is, if our great task is to honor the writer, then we have to honor both, we have to honor his poetry, but I understand that often these thick sections are the hardest things in the play. And we're going to get to that in a second, but we do have to find an understanding of why Shakespeare wrote it. And if we don't figure that out, we can't serve it. So this will often involve interpretation. The answers are not always obvious. Our very first week, we looked at a piece of Isabella. We're going to look at it again tonight when she says, oh God, what does she say? I have it here. His glassy essence. And I didn't know what it means. We didn't know what it means. There may be no text that can just tell you what it means. You may have to really make a choice. And that that is going to be interpretive. And the audience is not always going to understand it, that you made a choice. But your specificity in it will make your performance better. It will make you more specific. It won't be a hiccup in that sense. And often, I was speaking about this with my dear friend Scott Wentworth. Often those moments may well be the keys to the character. Often the moments where you sort of look at it and say, what the hell is this? Why is this here? Sometimes cracking those moments open may well be the key to your interpretation of that part. Not always. Sometimes they just suck and you have to make a decision and move on with it. But sometimes they may well be the key. So second, you must personalize it in your performance. So number one, specificity. Number two, personalization, right? Which means marrying the poetry to your character. Often you will see somebody playing a role and at some point the character sort of stops and they recite a chunk of poetry, then the character tries to jump back in. That's no good. We need to marry the poetry to the character. How do we do this? We must not separate the poetry and the character. We must deeply understand why the character needs the poetry. What do we need the poetry to express that can't be expressed otherwise? Or if it can be expressed otherwise, why isn't expressing it otherwise good enough? Where do we have to get to? Again, in terms of the heights of, and I spoke about this last week, we're playing both horizontally and vertically. So we're playing with the people, to the audience, in the sort of material world, but we're also playing to the heavens and the hells and the horizon of myth, right? So if we can say it practically, and much of poetry you can, why aren't we? Why do we need to go here? What is the higher calling of this moment, or this moment for the character? That's not to say there's always a higher calling for it. So we must always need it. You have to decide why the character needs it, what they're fighting for in it, how it relates to the argument. And in so doing, you will be personalizing it. You will stop the separation of poetry from character. Further, you need to personalize the imagery. The poetry is filled with imagery, and it needs to be something evocative and specific to you. John Rothman was talking about some images he was working with for Shylock in our first work of the night. When something really, if they say, I'm going to look at Henry VI in a second to just give you a speech of some imagery. I'm not going to linger on it as much as I sort of thought I might, but I still want to read it because it's a speech of poetry. He talks about the hawthorn bush. It's your job to look up what a hawthorn bush looks like. And not only just to do the research, but then to spend the time to think about it, to have the image in your head, to personalize it. What is that image that pops up when you say hawthorn bush? Now, do you need that image to pop up while you're on stage? Not necessarily. Everybody's process is different, but you owe it the time to personalize it, see it, envision it. And then in delivering it, in speaking it, you want to new mint it. This is relating to our sort of new ideas and coining. You want to find the phrase of the poetry. They're the exact words that you need. And so in the moment, you need to find them and new coin, new mint that poetry. So you're not just reciting, you're not reciting prescribed lines. And this is the final point. You must discover it. So you must be, specificity, personalization, and then discovery. So the final point is that you have to discover it. Like most things, this is not pre-thought out. In fact, ironically, most of the pre-thought poetry in Shakespeare is bad poetry. It's the sonnets of the young men in Love, Labour's Lost. It's even Hamlet's Stars Are Fire, etc. Shakespeare's writing intentionally bad poetry, often, when it's pre-written. This poetry is discovered. It may well be greater than any of us could ever improvise or discover, but that's not the point. This is heightened language in a heightened world. It is still your job to discover it, and in discovering it, new minting it, creating the images afresh. Yeah, you're trying to personally discover the images through the strength of your imagination for the first time. And now when I say for the first time, I don't mean I want you to discover it for the first time on stage. Again, a class about craft. I want you to take the time, build the foundation, do the work in the rehearsal hall, at home, wherever you're doing the work. Build the foundation so that you can discover it afresh every night on the stage, even when you're performing it 8 times a week. You're not gonna, inspiration's not gonna strike 8 times a week. You need to build a foundation where you can evoke it. So one of my last points last week was that sometimes, and I wanted to be careful with it, and I'm going to be careful with it now, sometimes you need to leave the poetry alone. Focus on the argument, let the poetry do its work. With that said, this is the work you need to do on the poetry. You need to build the foundation of it, specificity, personalization, discovery. And then once you've done those things, don't take those things onto stage. In rehearsal, do, but once you get to performance, you don't want to be leaning into the poetry. That's where we get into a bit of affectation. That's where we can get into a bit of recitation. Do the work, build the foundation, and then lean back off of it. Do your homework and then forget it, as the saying goes with much of the work. If you've done it well, if you've invested it, it'll still percolate. It'll still be there for you. But don't hammer a recitation when you get to it. Go back and focus on the argument. And with this work, the poetry will manage itself. So that is that's the lecture on playing poetry. Now I'm going to, again, originally I thought I might actually build this lecture around this speech and go into and out of it a lot, but I found that a bit, I don't know that it would have been great. So now, I haven't done now I have to find it. Give me 1 second. We are at, so this is Henry VI, Part 3, Act 2, Scene 5. So Henry VI, Part 3, Act 2, Scene 5. I will throw the link up into the chat. It is the speech that begins the scene. And so in this speech, we're going to hear both kinds of, they're not just 2 kinds, but we're going to hear both poetry that is necessary to expand the world, and at the same time, these 2 things aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes it'll be both, and the poetry that gives expression to the inexpressible. So we just listened to Margaret's, we just worked on Margaret's speech, which is wonderful. So this is just a little further on. There's another battle, this between the sons and Margaret and Clifford's forces. And Henry has been kicked out. He's been kicked out of the battle because he's bad luck. He's no good on the battlefield. He just wants to talk. He wants to try to find peace through words, and the warriors at this point don't want to hear it. So he feels like a failure as a king, and in many ways he is. And he feels like he's not supposed to be a king, but he really gives voice to it in this speech. He also finds he's also never seen a battle before, and he is finding language of the natural world to understand the battle, because he doesn't have a context for it. And then later, as he makes a discovery about what might be a better purpose for his life, being a shepherd, he comes into this beautiful sort of poetic meditation on how one could divide the hours of one's life. And what he's trying to do with that is understand his own feeling of wasted hours, because he doesn't feel like a good king, and in truth, he's not a good king. So he is discovering an understanding of himself against the obstacle of his own self-conflict. So I love this speech. I'm going to try to shape up the poetry in nice ways. I'm not going to try to lean into anything. I think this is just a nice example of a lot of the forms, and I hope it illuminates some of what we just talked about. So Henry enters alone and says, "This battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. What time the shepherd, blowing of his nails, can neither call it perfect day nor night. Now sways it this way, like a mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way, like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Well, sometime the flood prevails, and then the wind. Now one the better, then another best, both tugging to be victors, breast to breast, yet neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war. Here on this molehill will I sit me down. To whom God will, there be the victory. For Margaret, my queen, and Clifford too, have chid me from the battle, swearing both they prosper best when I am from thence. Would I were dead, if God's good will were so. For what is in this world but grief and woe? Oh God, methinks it were a happy life to be no better than a homely swain, to sit upon a hill as I do now, to carve out dials quaintly, point by point, thereby to see the minutes, how they run, how many make the hour full complete, how many hours bring about a day, how many days will finish up the year, how many years a mortal man may live. When this is known, then to divide the times. So many hours must I tend my flock. So many hours must I take my rest. So many hours must I contemplate. So many hours must I sport myself. So many days my ewes have been with young. So many weeks ere the poor fools will e'en. So many years ere I shall shear the fleece. So minutes, hours, days, months, and years passed over to the end they were created, would bring white hairs unto a quiet grave. What a life for this! How sweet, how lovely. Gives not the hawthorn bush a sweeter shade to shepherds looking on their silly sheep than doth a rich embroidered canopy to kings that fear their subjects' treachery? Oh yes, it doth. 1,000-fold it doth. And I'll stop there. So It's a beautiful speech. I love that speech. Maybe a bit too much. I might have been indulging a bit, but I hope you heard in all I was talking about all the aspects of the poetry. I think he uses all the tools that we talked about in terms of the purpose of the poetry. And then I hope my job in working on the part would be trying to use all my tools to play the poetry as best I could. Good. That's the lecture. Are there any immediate follow-up questions to that? In the participants menu, the raise hand option is the best way for me to see you. I'll keep an eye on the chat. All right. Great. Lovely. Okay. Well,